Hi guy, welcome to the AMIGArama podcast. I'm your host Lorfarius, and for this week we are going to be taking a look at Games Workshops Space Crusade. But as always, before we jump into the game, I thought we'd have a look at some Amiga news. First up, I'm happy to say we've had another Patreon supporter come forward, Retro Ravi, who I believe is also the chap behind the Retro Hour podcast, which pretty much, if you're in the retro scene, everyone knows what this is. Absolutely amazing podcast, weekly interviews. You know, it's great, it's fantastic. You should be listening to this as alongside AMIGArama because they're big Amiga fans. Of course, if you want to offer your support as well, you can just come along to patreon.com/AMIGArama. I do post lots of show notes on there for those who contribute. I think it's $4. Then there's just consider it a tip jar. It's nothing too fancy. You know, the show's not dependent on it, but it helps out with running costs and so on. And you can probably imagine, I mean, we're up to 26 episodes now, and I am doing this weekly, so it does cost for hosting and things like that. But I don't want to go on about that for too long. But anyway, big thank you to all those who have stepped forward and offered some support there. Another thing I have launched in the last couple of weeks, I've never really used it before, but I was looking at Discord, and I've actually gone and set up a AMIGArama Discord server. Now, I pretty much check that every day, so if you want to come along and join in the crowd, you can do. The link for that is really complicated, so I'm just going to stick it in the show notes, but you can find it on the Twitter account as well. I'll put a link in there, and it's just at AMIGArama Pod. But one of the great things I've been doing on there, particularly, is trying to pick a selection of games to use for upcoming episodes. I mean, we were talking about, well, I'm spoiling it a bit, I suppose, but looking at flight simulators, because I really want to cover one in a full episode, but I'm very aware that they are quite complicated and they need a lot of time sunk into them. So I think if I pick one in the early days and start reading through the manual and messing around with it, bits and bobs, and we'll build up to it eventually. I'm terrible at flight simulators, by the way. I'm fine with normal games. This is not my usual thing, but you know, the sacrifices I make for you guys, what can I say? About a week ago, Oldschoolgameblog.com came to me to mention that a demo scene chart disc magazine, which had been launched in the past, is currently opening up the doors to do another vote competition. If you're into the Amiga demo scene at all, you pretty much need to see this because the charts seem to be really, really popular. I had a quick look at the 7th issue because they sent me a link, but it really fascinating because it's actually something you can download and run on a real Amiga, and it's got all the demos and links. It's really great to see that the Amiga demo scene is still going almost 25 years later. But yeah, they really are putting some effort into stuff like this. But if you want to go and have a look at it, it is nucleus.nu. That's nucleus.nu. I will post a link. I'll also put up a link to the 7th issue. Like I say, if you've got an emulator or you've got an original Amiga, you can just download that and pore over it yourself. It was quite interesting, really. It really did catch my eye. Next thing I noticed in the news, Amiga J has released something called the Horizontal Shoot.Em.Up collection. Now, if you're familiar with his games, they're usually like CD32 collections that can be run straight from the CD drive on that system. From what I was looking at this one, it has around 28 games. A few of them off the top of my head. Silkworm, a fantastic shooter. Disposable Hero, things like Blood Money, both of the R-type games. I mean, the first one in particular is a really, really good Amiga arcade port. I'm probably going to cover that eventually because I really do need to do a decent shooter, and the R-type games have always stood out in my mind. But yeah, you can get that from cd32covers.blogspot.co.uk. As always, I will put a full link into the show notes. Now, something else that came to my attention several months ago, I think I might have mentioned it in a previous podcast, but there was basically like a Kickstarter for something called The Commodore Story. And this was meant to be like a full-on video history interviews talking back to everyone involved in the day, all very high quality and stuff, and I actually backed this at the time, and recently got a copy of the Blu-ray through the post, and it looks really impressive. It also came with like a small A5 book with all the interview quotes in, nice gorgeous colours and everything. It's still available. I think you can order it. I think it's about $24.99 or it might be £30, but I'm really impressed with the look at it. I've not had a chance to watch it yet because it's I think it's about 2.5 hours long, but it does come with a couple of extra features. You've got things like trailers, something called the Chip Tune Story, which was an earlier documentary I think the same guys did. That's about an hour long. It comes on 2 Blu-ray discs. I think there's a DVD option, and there's also a digital download you can do as well. But it's great seeing stuff like this, especially on the history side. I mean, a lot of these people now, they're in like the 60s and 70s. I mean, the Amiga's heyday has long gone in that sense. So it's great that they're all being so fully interviewed. I mean, they've all got fantastic stories to say, and I'm really looking forward to watching it. Not had a chance yet. I will sit down to that soon, because I'll say it's a couple of hours, but I will take the time and get into it. Finally, for the last bit of news, this isn't really Amiga related, but I did mention how I'd picked up a C64 Mini. I think that was last episode. I finally got a chance to sit down and play with it properly and load some ROMs onto a USB stick and stuff, which is absolutely fantastic because I love that sort of thing because it's nice and easy, it's plug and play. I mean, the thing about this as a system, it's not like a Raspberry Pi in that access, you're not installing tons and tons of systems on it. It's very much like plug and play, and I don't think it's meant for the hardcore Raspberry Pi sort of user. It's just like something simple that plugs into the side of the TV and you can play some simple games and stuff. If you want to go the next stage up, it's got like C64 Basic on there, so if you want you could code on it. You have to use like a USB keyboard. It does only come with 2 USB ports on the side, which is a bit of a pain really, because once you've got the USB stick in there and you want to use like the keyboard and stuff, all the ports are taken up, but it does accept hubs, which is absolutely fantastic. Now they've only just released update 1.06. One thing I'm really looking forward to is, at the moment, you've got the 64 games on it, which are all fine, by the way. Quite happy with them. Things like School Days and I can't even remember now. There's loads of the Impossible Mission. I think I was playing the other day. I had a lot of fun with that. But I want to play things like Myth on it, which we covered in last week's episode, because I really want to sink some proper time into the C64 edition. So this is it. It's perfect. Really is a perfect and handheld to have. I don't really have any problems with it in general, except for the fact that you can't add games to the main menu, whereas something like the NES Mini at the moment can be hacked to add extra games, which is great. So this does have that facility. Somebody's already been like hacking bits of scripts into the sides and stuff to do interesting things with, so there's a lot coming its way. The next update is promising to be able to add like pictures, so it's on the main menu, so you can select your own discs and load them and stuff. Biggest issue I thought with it, when you're using the joystick, I mean, I'm proper old school. I go a bit overboard when I'm using stuff, especially when I'm like waggling the stick away and I'm really lost in like a sports game. So the joystick can take a fair bit of abuse, but there were a few times I was pushing it to the far edge and it felt a bit like, oh, better calm down there. Don't go too overboard, because you might break it if you put too much force into it. But like all things in it, you've got to be careful, and stuff these days isn't made as good as it used to be in the 80s and 90s when kids were doing all sorts with joysticks. But yeah, that's me only complaint with it really, but I've had fantastic fun with it. I'm exploring big chunks of the C64 library and I'm looking forward to the updates. Fantastic bit of kit. With that, it's time to move on to this week's game. Now, for this week, I've gone and picked Space Crusade. Now, obviously, because we've covered Hero Quest umpteen episodes ago, I wanted to come back to this, basically just to complete the Games Workshop set, if you can call it that. But in particular, I have quite a lot of experience of playing this from when I was a kid. It was one of those multiplayer games I would go around to my friend's house and we'd just spend absolutely hours upon hours with. I mean, the levels were nice and long. It was quite addictive for a group of nerdy kids to play, because we love stuff like that, big long games, almost RPG like where you have to take your time to think your way through them, because we had a lot of time going on in the evenings, and it was the perfect title for it. Now, it was published by Gremlin and developed by a spin-off called Rapier. They were also responsible for MiG-29 Soviet Fighter. I'm not sure if that's, I should have actually checked that. I'm not sure if that's just the shooter that Codemasters did, or if it was the actual flight simulator game maybe done by another company. I'm not sure. It come on 2 discs and was released in 1992. And so it's got a total of, it can have up to 3 players, one of which has to be the computer. Now, it was coded by Michael Hart, who we've mentioned before. He was responsible for Hero Quest 1 and 2, and I believe the spin-off expansion discs as well. K240, which is like a strategy game. MiG-29, again, I should have checked what the difference is between them two. And Necronom. I'm not even sure what that is, but that's probably the best game name I've ever heard. That sounds fantastic. Graphics were done by Adrian Carlos. He was responsible for, loads and loads of different things, but some of the standout games were Zool, Little Devil, which was sort of like... It was like a very cartoony style game. I think it came out on the CD32. And basically, it was a bit like that... Dragon's Lair, which was pretty much ported to every system known to man, but it was that sort of graphical cartoon style, and having to move around objects and avoid things out of the way. A similar sort of game. Also Golden Axe, which is quite highly rated for the Amiga. I could go on and on. He's been involved in loads of classic games. It's surprising when I was looking through his list just how many. Now, the music for this was done by Barry Leach, who was involved in Ultima 5, classic RPG there straight away. Utopia, that's another strategy game. Lethal Weapon, I think that's pretty poor platformer. Back to the Future 3, oh my god, this is not saying much for Hero Quest did the music for that. And next up we had Ian Howe involved in it. He did pretty much all the Humans games. I've never really played them extensively enough to recognise the music, but I think there was about 3 or 4 of them over several years. One called Ragnarok, and Supercars 2, which has got an amazing soundtrack. So straight away you've got the music in some very, very special people's hands. It was converted, as I said before, pretty much every system known to man, but the ones that really stood out to me were the Amstrad CPC versions, Commodore 64, Spectrum, Atari ST, PC or DOS. I mean, this was I think it was pre-Windows even, because I'd say 92, it probably would have been. When did 3.1 come out? Was that 91, 92? Anyway, it was a DOS game. Now, a bit later on, several months in fact, which seemed to match what happened with Hero Quest, they did like a data disc or an expansion for this, which was just called The Voyage Beyond. Now, I did have a look at that, and from what I could tell, it had much bigger maps and levels, as well as a much higher difficulty with loads of extra ranks added in. I mean, it's quite limited, I think, in the first game, and weapons as well for you to choose from and to expand your team. Now, one of the biggest and most surprising things about this game, especially when you get into playing it come with a 35-page manual. Now, maybe that doesn't sound like a lot if you're like looking at like flight simulators or some of the RPGs and some of the strategy games, but for something like this, it surprised me because we'll get into later when you're actually learning how to play the game compared to the amount of knowledge you need whilst you're going through the game, and it really did make me want to go back and have a look at the manual for the original board game, because I suspect it's probably just as big. And if you've not guessed by now, it is based on the original Games Workshop board game, which was originally designed by a chap called Stephen Baker. From what I could find out from interviews and chats, though, he didn't have any involvements whatsoever with the computer games. And since it's going down, I found that a bit strange in a way, because seeing as it's going down the same route as Hero Quest, where they're trying to make it a direct replica of the game, if you will, in computer version, it was a bit odd that he didn't have any involvement, but I don't know. I think that the 90s were probably a different time. Now, Space Crusade takes place in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. That's pretty much as in-depth as it goes, though. And though I never really played this as a board game whilst I was growing up, I did play Hero Quest, but for umpteen years during my teens, I was actually quite into the whole Warhammer 40k and painting models, and I think I've still got some old pictures of miniatures dotted around somewhere, and no, I'm not going to post them because most of them are quite blurry and out of focus. They're as terrible as you can pretty much imagine. The board game needs 2 to 4 players to play, one of which is a bit like the Dungeon Master and has to control the aliens or the enemies. Now, I couldn't really find any sales figures for this, but it only seemed to be available for a couple of years. From what I could tell, it didn't seem to be as big as a hit as Hero Quest. Like I say, without sales figures, it's difficult to tell, but I was certainly into this sort of thing back in the day, and the one big game that I would see everywhere was Hero Quest, and it was the one I got experience with. And this, it never even crossed my radar. It's pretty much the game the Amiga game which probably introduced me to it at the time, so make of that what you will. Despite having such a huge manual and being based around the whole 40k universe, there isn't actually any story to this game, and what you get when you first read it is just a brief description of what it's all about as a universe and where all like the space marines that are involved come from and the aliens and stuff, but it doesn't launch you onto the game, and all you're presented with when you first start is just a huge list of missions. Now, there's 20 in total, and to beat each you have to get a set number of points. You can of course select pretty much any when you first start off, but the difficulty does increase as you go along. A lot of these include things like finding an enemy, destroying a group of enemies, discovering the dreadnought, that sort of thing. Like even the very first mission is something simple like find an android and defeat it, and depending on the difficulty it can be quite tough. Now, the game itself is a 3D isometric view. I'm not quite sure how else to explain it. Now, there is a 2D overhead map. That pretty much covers the majority of the game while you're looking straight down, but you can flick between the two modes. Now, the 3D is quite well presented. Every character is quite well defined. You can realise what they are and stuff. And as you explore different parts of, you're basically on an abandoned, it's like a space hulk or a spaceship, if you like. You get to choose from several of the Space Marine Corps, and you're free on offer here, and there's the Blood Angels, Imperial Fists, and the Ultramarines. Now, the Ultramarines were pretty much the ones I used to paint back in the day. They're like your de facto Space Marines, and I think they're the most popular in the Games Workshop line of Marines. Now, each of these Marines have a special skill or a weapon for the leader. Leader is usually called the captain or a sergeant, depending. And each of the items they hold are like a grenade, it's called like a melter bomb, and a med kit, but it depends entirely on which team you've chosen. I think the Ultramarines have like the med kit. Now, the Space Marines do level up between the missions. It's not really leveling up, though. They do sort of gain experience if they survive, but they basically gain rank, and I think the highest you can get up to is like the Sergeant Coptus or Coptus. I'm not sure now. I can't actually pronounce it. Now, the entire game is pretty much mouse driven, though you do have the option to use the keys, which especially comes in handy, especially if you've got multiple people playing. You get presented with several squares on the screen. The main play area, which takes up about a third in a big square section. Off to the top right is like the list of position of the Marine that you've selected, what weapon they're holding. Then another mini square, which has got like the map in. Then along the bottom is like a steel bar, which is full of like numerous icons, and they include things like move, fire, a close combat button, user skill, scan the surrounding area, and enter. Nice and simple. There's also a bar full of each Marine that you can view and flick between. You can also see their what their energies. They can take up to 2 hits depending on the combat. There's also an extra button which lets you flick into the 3D mode, though that is quite consuming, resource consuming, depending on what Amiga you've got, and it can actually run quite slow. So what you're probably tend to find is you'll stick to the 2D mode just because it's a lot better for it. There is no music during the game. You don't get anything going on beyond sound effects. But one thing I did want to bring up, when you first start it off, it comes with this, like, it sounds like a Marine speaking, and it's like, "Welcome to Space Crusade." And all of a sudden it loads the main title screen, which is a few Marines stood there with weapons, and then they open with a scream, big loud scream, and then start firing them all, and then there's like guns reloading. It sounds absolutely fantastic, and this music kicks in. It's a very low sounding, it's almost like it's on an electric guitar. It reminded me of like the Terminator 2 theme, it had that sort of thing going on, but it's quite a catchy bit of music, and it's probably one of the better Amiga tunes I've heard, and it suits the game perfectly. But the sad thing is, that's it. There's nothing else within the game. This plays throughout the menus, and it's quite long. It doesn't seem to loop too much, and it's catchy enough. But it is a bit disappointing that they've got this awesome sort of music already, and they could do so much more of it, but it's just not there. The sound effects in the game, there's a sound effect for pretty much everything. You've got things for like firing weapons, screams of pain when yourself or enemies die, lots of explosions, usually a nice big loud kaboom and when things go off, which is quite satisfying. The graphics can be a bit, they can be a bit bland. I felt looking at it that especially when you look in the 3D section, it doesn't seem zoomed in enough, and you've already got a small area on the map anyway, so it just doesn't quite work as well as it should. But you can more than make out what each of the characters are. Most of the Marines look the same, the enemies are all pretty much the same, and the leaders and so on, but it just needed a bit more there on the graphics, I think. The whole game is pretty much a close replica of the board game. It even replicates things like the random dice throws. Those are represented by little numbers in the corner off to a side box, which roll for attack and roll for damage, and it's quite straightforward. Things like line of sight are there, and weapons which need to be used smartly. The characters can choose from a selection of assault cannons, missile launchers, bolt pistols, power sword, power gloves, pretty much everything that you'd see in the standard Warhammer 40k universe. Now each does have a different sort of range and damage, and you tend to have to be in like line of sight to do these attacks properly. Again, it's very, very similar to Hero Quest, but because this is based within like a spaceship, and you've got corridors and stuff and closable doors and things, there's a very strong tactical element to the entire game, and a lot of it comes down to hunting and being hunted depending on what's going on. Loads of the missions consists of just exploring an area, doing lots of scanning. The scanning is nice and simple. You just press a button, and in a surrounding area you get like an orange circle warbles out, and then it uncovers anything, and it will come up with like a green indicator on in the area on the map, only in the area if you've not actually been into a section before. And then if you go around the corner, you can tell if maybe it's a blockage, or it's an item or something, or some sort of enemy, something that's in the way there. But as you're exploring, take your time. The enemies can also move and track you down as well. So it's a bit 50-50 depending on what the actual mission is. But the thing about it is it's best to plan ahead. You can't just run around willy-nilly hoping to take a group into an area and hope to take things out, because before long you will get surrounded. The enemies do react, and if there's some attacks going on or there's doors open and shots being fired, the enemies do swarm to any sort of trouble. Now you have a limit of around 39 turns per game, but you must be back in the starting area by the time that's finished, or that's it, you just fail the mission and you don't get enough points, and that's the end of it. But what this tends to end up doing, it turns it into this very tense situation where you might not have enough turns, say, to get to the other side of the map to do something, and then even if you do manage it, it might take you ages to beat a battle or to get through a section, and then you've got to make your way back. So you have to be quite smart with it. You can't spend forever like wandering through different sections of the map. I mean, you can if you replay the quests and the missions, I suppose, but it does become very claustrophobic very, very quickly and incredibly intense. Now, of course, this does come with its problems. One of the biggest, which has just made me chuckle really, is that the manual is 35 pages long. Now, I didn't actually read the manual when I first started playing it, and which is why it made me question the manual so much, because I found it literally took me like a couple of minutes to work out what the buttons do and what needs doing. It's very, very straightforward. It doesn't really need to explain itself. So to have so much text and then none of the text to sort of like link in a story, just talk about how real details of moving between bits of combat, but there's just far too much unneeded text. Now, the biggest problem is again, there's just no story linking anything together. When you with Hero Quest, you had like a villain and there was a huge story going there, and you got all these nice fancy cutscenes, and it just drew you in. It made you feel that this was more than just like a replica of a board game, but this one just feels like a very good, but it is just a pure replica of what you could buy in the shops. And at the same time, you just think, well, this is a computer game. You just expect a bit more. One thing which I did find really annoying, they don't seem to have programmed a second disc option into it. Now, it's not too bad if you're playing on WHD low, because it's all in one location, so it doesn't bother you whatsoever. But trying to load this from like ADFs, and of course with the original, it will ask for the second disc, and even if you've got the option set to have like disc number 2 in the drive, it doesn't recognise it. You have to eject the disc and then put it in and then flick it over, and you just think that's just incredibly lazy. It would have probably taken them seconds just to make the game scan for other discs in the drive. It's nothing major, but it happens in between every single mission. One of the other big problems, of course, is the lack of music. That title opening with the voice and then the sound effects is absolutely fantastic, and then you've got this kick-ass tune. It really is. It really does match the game brilliantly. It really puts you in for that. This is going to be intense and exciting. And then you get in the game and there's just nothing there. It's just sound effects. And it was very, very depressing. Now, despite having 3 different lots of Space Marines to choose from, I don't know if this is really a complaint because they're Space Marines after all, so they're all pretty generic and pretty much the same from different chapters, but there's no real difference between them. The thing is, depending on which part you choose, you start off in a different part of the map, and I checked this on multiple missions, it's always the same thing, but you just think, beyond the colours, there's just nothing there, and playing them doesn't change any story element, because there isn't one, there's nothing going on. It's just personal preference on which sounds the best. Now, each game can take up to about 45 minutes, but that's quite a long time, I felt, especially for a computer game. But there's no save feature. You can save the commander, but only between, you have to complete a mission and it lets you save it, and that's all very well and good. But there are times when I'm just sat there, especially when I'm trying to do this as a review, because I think, I've just spent about 15-20 minutes of it, come back to it later. Luckily you can on emulation, but if you're doing it on the original Amiga, you've just got no choice, and it just very, very annoying. Also, the game can become a fair bit samey. The missions are all pretty much the same thing, and you're always in the same space hulk and the ships. And I know that's probably it's not really the fault of the game. It's because of what it's based on. But Hero Quest was based on a board game as well, and they did stretch it out a bit and they made it more gamey, and it was all the more better for it. I'm not entirely sure what they could have done to improve it. Maybe put in a first-person view, because there are times when you're stood in a dark corner, you might be on your own, or there's another Marine with you, and you've got a load of enemies coming up. And it'd been great if you could have had a little box in the corner, say, where the weapons are or the map, which would just revert to a 2D first-person view with things flicking around. I'm probably asking too much, but then again, 92, when was Gloom and all them sort of things a few years later, or Space Hulk, because I think Space Hulk does that as a game. Now, the whole thing does depend on dice rolls. Of course, you don't see any of this. It's just flicking numbers. And they're supposed to be, random. But a fair few times I was stood there and I would keep getting very, very similar numbers over and over and over again. And at one point, a couple of times I sat there thinking, I'm going to get 10, I'm going to get 10, I got a 10. Next turn, I'm going to get 10, I'm going to get 10. got a 10, next turn, and that kept happening over and over and over again, and with different numbers too, like 2 and 0 would happen all the time, and maybe it was just a bit of bad luck or something, but when it kept happening repeatedly, I was just like, is there something wrong with the random number generator? Is it random, or has it just not been programmed correctly? I've got a pretty strong suspicion of what it might be. Although it's based on the board game, I did feel that, especially with the combat and what we've got here presented, it just needed a little bit more. It could have, rather than just dice, maybe a bit more an interactive element, a way to do something during the combat that's not just sat there like click the mouse button once, let it roll and then continue. Yeah, maybe that would break the board game a bit, but when you've got such this intense atmosphere going on around you, and you know it's very claustrophobic and things, you want to feel more in control. Maybe that's why the game feels like that, because you don't really have that control, and it is all down to random chance, but it just feels like, you know, a bit of a tweak there. It could have improved it drastically. Looking at the Amiga mags from the time, CU Amiga gave this 92%, Amiga Action 91%, Amiga Computing 91%, The One 89%, Amiga Power 85%, and Amiga Format, probably the lowest at 82%, so it was very, very highly rated. I'll have to say for myself, it did not feel like a 90%er. As I had fun with it, there was enough there, but it just wasn't enough to push you over that edge. It felt, 82% feels about right. I say very, very highly rated. Then again, later on when they were doing re-releases, a fair few of these did knock about 5 or 10% off, so yeah, maybe it was just a timing thing. Now, the whole game does work quite well as a version of the board game. I really did enjoy, like, when you're being hunted, you're even on the hunt yourself, because it's great to be after one or two enemies and they're trying to scarp, or when you get stuck in a situation, it might be like one or two of you left and they're trying to trap you in a corner and hunt you down, because the combat works to a degree. It works quite well for that, and it can be quite scary when you're stuck on your own, and it's like, say it's a dreadnought or a really tough enemy, and you're just there with your diddly little bolt pistol trying to take them out. You lose most of it. You can die, by the way. That's it. It is quite a basic game, and it's pretty much it's a straight copy of what goes on in the board game. It's basically, we've just added sound effects and things, which is great if you like it. But again, for a computer game, people are always expecting that a little bit more. The lack of a story is it's silly, really. You've already got that Warhammer 40k universe. I said that before, but they could have done so much with it and tied it all together. Maybe done a few cutscenes, added a bit more music in, especially with the sound effects. It would have just worked perfectly, a bit even better game. One thing this does have is lots and lots of atmosphere, especially with that claustrophobic feeling you get when you're wandering around the corridors trying to work out where the enemies are. But if you'd had more music and a better story, it would have. I know it's like playing a 90s versions of Aliens, really, because that's pretty much what you're hunting. Now, it does have quite a slow pace to it. It's quite methodical. You've got to take your time with it. And it's just not up there with Hero Quest. Hero Quest, if I had to choose between the two, easily Hero Quest every single time. But just because it's just that little bit better, it just goes into the special territory. And I can understand why the mags might have been excited about this, especially because it depends on, really, I think, on the person who would have played it and liked that sort of game. But it's just not tweaked enough. It just needs a little bit more for greatness, and it's an 80% by far. One of the greatest things I did like about it, though, is this problem with a lot of these Amiga games, especially with complicated ones which are based around RPGs and board games and strategy, is you have to read the massive manuals, but you really didn't need to with this. I have said it's really, really long, but I didn't even need to go back to it. I only really read it because I was checking the story out, and then I ended up reading through the rest of it just to see what it was actually going on about. It was completely pointless. But yeah, I will say I did quite enjoy my time with this. I would recommend it. It's definitely worth playing. I would also say if you do manage to get through this, I think there's about 5 or 6 hours worth of gameplay, it's well worth picking up the expansion pack as well, because all the extra missions and stuff all there just up the difficulty massively. But by all means, do not play that expansion pack first. You can if you want to, but the missions are really, really difficult. It's like everything's turned up to 11. It's absolutely crazy. Now, I think that's as good a time as any to finish the podcast. As always, thanks for listening. If you've any comments or want to send any emails, you can drop me a line at Lorfarius@AMIGArama.com, or just visit AMIGArama.com if you want to see some gameplay footage of this or just general info about it. And with that, I will see you next time.